everyone. I hope you had a nice, even if short, lunch break, and welcome for all those that connected today, specifically for this session on nature and biodiversity. The session is moderated by my colleague Laszlo Beksi, Head of Sector for Nature and Biodiversity in CINEA. So Laszlo and the rest of the team, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you all for attending the meeting. This afternoon, we would have 3 sub-sessions during our presentations. First of all, our colleagues from DG Environment will present the policy priorities and the project topics, so to see what LIFE can do and what we expect the projects to work on. And then my colleague Anita Fassio will talk about the call itself, the specificities of the Nature and Biodiversity subprogram call. And then finally, there would be a presentation by one of our projects on grasshoppers. And each of the sessions will be followed by a Q&A session. But colleagues from DGM will stay also for the second stage, so you can still have questions after Anita's presentation linked to the topics and priorities. So with that short intro, I give you the floor, Frank, to start your presentation.
Thank you, Laszlo, and yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So it's my pleasure to give you a brief overview over the priority topics for standard action projects under Life, Nature and Biodiversity. And just to remind that these priorities are for a 4-year period, the period of a multi-annual work program, which is until 24. Possibly we will have some new priorities or at least a minor review of the priorities for the last 3 years of a LIFE regulation from 25 to 27. So next slide, please. Yeah, and in fact, the subs have been designed in a specific way. And you see the title here, Smart and Outcome-Based Implementation of EU Nature and Biodiversity Legislation, or Targets of the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. That really summarizes a lot. And to make it a bit clearer what it means, we have devised 2 areas of intervention. One is called Space for Nature and the other Safeguarding Our Species. And 2 policy priorities. And one of the priorities that is linked to our existing nature and biodiversity legislation, and that is the EU Birds and Habitats Directive, but also the Invasive Alien Species Regulation. And the second policy priority, that is not a regulation, it's our biodiversity strategy for 2030, which was adopted 2 years ago, endorsed by the Council and Parliament. And so we have a political mandate to work on these objectives in the strategy. And there is 2 big chapters in the strategy that are really relevant for the work for LIFE also and for the work inside the European Union. One is about establishing a trans-European nature network of protected areas that is not just about Natura 2000, but also about nationally protected areas and connectivity. And the other is about restoration, because we know that there is a need for restoration in many situations. We have already gone too far. It's not just enough to protect, we also need to restore. Next slide, please. So basically what it means here, this is again the 2 intervention areas, Space for Nature and Safeguarding Our Species. And on the other hand, the policy priorities, the existing legislation and the biodiversity strategy. So whenever you have a proposal that broadly falls into at least one of the 2 areas of intervention and at least one of the 2 policy priority areas, it can be financed, so it is eligible through a standard action project under Life, Nature and Biodiversity. So it's quite broad what can be financed, but then we need to look at what is the most important things to finance, and that is coming in the next slides. Next, please. So just for the 2 areas of intervention, so Space for Nature, what does it mean? It's actually everything that is related to work on certain areas. It can be management, it can be restoration, improving natural or semi-natural habitats, habitats of species. It's not related strictly to protected areas. It can happen everywhere where it is needed. It might also be linked to the creation or designation of new protected areas, or improving their focus on biodiversity, ecological corridors, and green infrastructure. And it might also include some testing or demonstrating of new site management approaches, etc. And this is not an exclusive list, so there might be other ways to fall into space for nature. It is for you then to argue that this is the case. When it comes to the species, you know that certain species-related measures cannot be covered by area-based conservation or restoration. And whenever that is not possible, your project would rather fall under the second area of intervention, which is safeguarding our species. And again, there is a wide range of possible measures that might apply here, from hard infrastructure works, captive breeding, reducing mortality on infrastructures. Awareness raising might sometimes be the main reason to reduce the main tool to reduce the pressure on a species. So again, this is a very wide range, and the list is not exclusive here. It is really for you to argue whether it falls into this. And of course, it must be linked in that case to the objective of improving the situation of a species, or at least maintaining it in the current stage if there is a threat. So next slide, please. Yeah, I just wanted to remind you what is SMART, because you have seen the abbreviation. SMART is specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, and time-related. So I think this is about the clarity of your proposal, to be clear about what your proposal targets, to be clear what you want to do, how much you want to achieve, where, by whom it will be done, that it's realistic given the available resources, and of course that you have a credible time planning. So this is about the clarity of your proposal, and keep in mind this is an important one when it comes to the assessment of your project. Next slide, please. And in order to be very clear what your project is about, just to let you know why we need this, it's not just about the reality, the feasibility of your project, but also to prioritize. Because unfortunately, in the last years, we see a lot of proposals coming in, a lot of good proposals, but our resources are unfortunately limited. And therefore, there is a competition. And unfortunately, each year, there is very good proposals that are not financed because there isn't enough enough funding to serve all the good proposals. So there is a competition, and you really need to convince and present your proposal in a way that it is clear that this is the priority. And what are the priorities? Well, we have, when it comes to the conservation status of species and habitats that are covered by EU legislation, the priority is for those species and habitats that are in the worst conservation status and with negative trends. So that is very important, and you know where to find this information, hopefully. If not, look at the documents and call documents. There is explanation. You will find certain links where to look up whether your species is reported in your country in that status or not. There are some species for which we don't have this kind of assessment. That is the case for the birds that fall under the Birds Directive, but also for all the species and habitats that are not covered by EU legislation. And this can also be subject to live funding. And we will see a project later on presented by Lisbeth Sechner, which is about the cricket that is critically endangered at European level, but it's not listed in the Habitats Directive. So whenever you have a target species or habitat that in an EU red list is at the high extinction risk, so it is labeled as endangered or worse, that would be a priority for funding under LIFE. And there is some specific situation in outermost regions and overseas territories where we do not have European red lists. There, the global IUCN red lists would, of course, apply. Next slide, please. And likewise, the prioritization has not just been used when it comes to the ranking of a proposal, but also in terms of the co-funding. And we have actually 3 co-funding rates. The highest 75%, that applies to the highest priorities. And that's including all the species and habitats listed as priority species already in the annexes of the Habitats Directive, certain bird species. And there we have a list that is based on an expert work, and that was approved by the Committee of the Member States. And you can find that on the internet. There is a link in the application documents. The species that are and habitats that are in the worst conservation status and declining, U2 minus, that's the labeling. The species not covered by the annexes of the directives and the habitats as well, because there's a habitat rest list that have been assessed as endangered or worst. So, and then there is a specific provisions when we talk about, let's say, territories outside the strict European Union territory or outside the territory that is covered by the EU red list. For example, the French outermost regions, they're part of the European Union, but they are not covered by the EU red list, and there the global IUCN red lists would apply. In any case, you will always need to argue that your proposals falls into the eligibility range for 75% co-funding, which means that all actions in your project must clearly be tailored towards those habitats and species that qualify for 75%. And if that's not the case, if you are a mix between non-priority and priority species or habitat targeted actions, then you are eligible up to 67% only. And in all other cases, the maximum for funding is 60%. So it's more or less the same logic than for the prioritization of the projects that is also used for the co-funding rates. Next slide, please. We often get questions about best practice demonstration and innovation. Do nature and biodiversity projects be innovative? The answer is no, they don't need to be innovative. In certain cases, what needs to be done is best practice, and we don't want to penalize a good best practice project. What is important is that you can always show that your project is really fit for purpose. And it could be an innovative project. Actually, we don't discourage innovation or demonstration, but best practice are equally eligible. Next slide, please. So now 3 slides that go a bit more into detail for the policy priorities. I start with the EU Birds and Habitats Directive, where we of course give priority to the conservation status and trends and projects that improve these statuses and trends, in particular when these measures have been outlined by your national authority in the national or regional prioritized action frameworks. And when it comes to space for nature, it is primarily about implementing conservation objectives for existing Natura 2000 sites, but this might also be actions outside Natura 2000. When it comes to the area of intervention, protecting our species, it is very often linked to the need to reduce the mortality for these species or to increase the breeding success. And a typical example is poisoning, illegal killing, bycatch, electrocution on power lines, but also preventing stakeholder conflicts. This might sometimes be the most important thing to do. And while we generally focus on the species and habitats in the worst conservation status, when it comes to avoiding conflicts with stakeholders, think about the wolves and large carnivores. That is a priority because we have really some important policy issues there in terms of acceptance of coexistence with these animals. So when we talk about the so-called problem species, then we deviate a bit from the priority for conservation status, because most of these species are actually recovering, but the more they recover, the bigger the conflict. So we need to manage the conflict. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to the invasive alien species regulation, priority is given to proposals that address those species that are already included in the list of invasive species of European Union concern. And this list has been updated several times, and it will be updated further. So additional species might be added in the near future. So keep an eye on which species these are. But then we have some specific issues with invasive species that also negatively affect the conservation status of friends of species that are either listed by in the Habitats and Birds Directive or are otherwise threatened in the EU Red List. So whenever you work on an issue that is about tackling invasive alien species that negatively affect, let's say, these priority features, that would also be a priority under this policy area of the invasive alien species regulation. So next slide, please. Now, this is almost my last slide, and unfortunately, we will not be able to go into the details here, but under the EU biodiversity strategy, we have a lot of different targets, and many of these are also priorities for LIFE funding. First of all, establishing a coherent network of protected areas. You might have heard that by 2030, 30% of the EU land and sea area and 10% of the 30% should be protected and 10% strictly protected, and all these areas should be effectively managed. That's a very ambitious target under the EU biodiversity strategy. It does not cover just Natura 2000, but also nationally protected areas and connectivity. Projects working towards achieving that objective are, of course, of a high priority because that's a big challenge. Then we have this specific target about species and habitats that should be brought into a better conservation status. This is largely about EU nature legislation and the pledges. So when the member states have submitted pledges for these species and habitats and say, we want to improve them by 2030, that would be a priority under LIFE to implement these pledges. Restoration of degraded and carbon-rich ecosystems, so the link between nature protection or ecosystem conservation and climate mitigation or adaptation is obviously a priority. But keep in mind that some of these projects can also be financed under LIFE Climate. So this is an additional funding opportunity, for example, when it comes to carbon capture, but also climate adaptation and mitigation more broadly. We have another priority in the strategy, which is about managed forests. So it's not just about strictly protecting old growth forest and increasing the coverage of strictly protected forest areas, but also improve the health and resilience of managed forests, and of course, in particular to biodiversity. Our colleagues in Unit D1 have issued some guidance documents on close to nature forestry. So even testing and demonstrating such action might be something that could be a priority under LIFE, Nature and Biodiversity. You know that we have a priority on pollinators, and actions that would clearly target pollinators are also an important feature under LIFE. Bringing back nature to agricultural land, which is all about making agricultural land more resilient, more biodiversity friendly, is a priority topic outside protected areas, of course, but also the urban perspective, because there is a lot of things that could be done in urban areas, including sometimes for highly threatened species. Then we have a bit of a specific topic, measuring and integrating the value of nature, which is actually not so much outcome focused, so it perhaps doesn't match so well the overall logic of LIFE, Nature and Biodiversity subs, but still it is mentioned in the topics document as a priority. So we would certainly welcome some proposals, but keep in mind that there must be some way to link this also to the priorities that we have just mentioned, so the smart outcome-based focus. And next slide. Next slide, yes. So that's the last slide. Just keep in mind that we have limited resources, and it is very important that you perform well in the competition, which unfortunately is becoming very hard. That's also why we have a stronger focus now on those species and habitats that are the most threatened in the worst conservation status. There are some exceptions from this rule, as I mentioned before: urban greening, integrating the value of nature, what I mentioned on large carnivores, but overall it's a principle. And then keep in mind that Life Nature subs not finance any more pure communication and awareness raising projects, nor projects focusing on monitoring or inventories. But all these actions can still be covered in the subs, if you can argue that. But there might also be other project types, in particular the strategic nature action projects that might cover these issues. So I think that's the end of my presentation. I'm aware that we went a bit over time. Apologize for that. And I hope we still have some time for questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Frank. So let's see if we have a few questions.
Okay.
Yes,
so
maybe take the first one immediately.
Yes. Are the life sub projects only possible on Natura 2000 areas, or can they be implemented in any region? Well, in principle, they can be implemented anywhere. When projects happen outside protected areas, there is always the issue of a sustainability of investment. So I think you really need to show either that there is a clear added value. Well, you need to show that there is a clear added value anyway, but you also need to show somehow that despite the fact that this land is not receiving any legal protection status, that the investment is sustainable. Okay, the next question.
Yes, let's see which we take next. Can you react to this define and give example of a nature-based solutions? Maybe Daniel.
Yeah, this would be for my colleague.
Yeah,
there are many examples of nature-based solutions. It can be restoring wetlands, restoring floodplains to prevent flooding, changing forest the forest management that are more in line with the guidelines on closer to nature forestry by changing species composition, age composition. In urban greening, going for green roofs or changing some urban areas to solve flooding. Think about recreating vegetation on mountain slopes to avoid landslides or erosion. So nature-based solutions, yeah, the Commission's definition can cover a lot. Solutions that are inspired and supported by nature, which are cost-effective and simultaneously provide environmental, social, and economic benefits. So be creative. A lot of these actions that could be labeled as nature-based solutions are not per se recognized by it. But if it is an environmental-driven solution that is cost-effective and helping you to solve environmental, social, and economic problems, it is a nature-based solution. So I can continue for half an hour more with examples, but I think there is a lot of variety here.
Thank you, Daniel. I think it was a good collection of information. I would take a different question. It's from Frank regarding the SDF. So if you want to restore a habitat that is not mapped and not in the SDF of the Natura 2000 site, how should it be proven that this habitat exists?
Well, as I said, the budget is limited. We have a lot of proposals. I would really strongly advise to go to your national authority to ask them to update the SDF, because they are supposed to do this on an annual basis. And actually we get new data every year and come back next year when the habitat is in the SDF.
And maybe just one last question before we move to the next session. That's again, I think for Daniel, that which are the most powerful tools for mobilization of citizens and private sector for NBS, if this is within your merits to answer. I don't hear you, Daniel.
Can you hear him or?
No, not Daniel. I can hear you, but not Daniel.
Seems to be an issue with this microphone then.
Maybe give it to him.
So a very powerful tool is reach out and talk to people, build your network, go out there, meet them. There are many tools that can support that through social media, community events, going to talk with your communities, build the network you do, are all very powerful tools. But again, be creative. I think most powerful tools, it really depends what you want to reach, what you mobilize. If you want to involve private sector into certain in dealing with invasive alien species, you will take a very different approach by then creating restoring a local wetland to prevent flooding. So I think there are many solutions, and you be creative in this. So think about the context you're in, and think about how you would reach out to your community or to the private sector that you want to involve in your business.
Okay, thank you for the advice, Daniel. And I think it's time for us to move on to our next presentation by Anita. But as I mentioned, the colleagues from DGM will stay on board. So if you are still coming up with questions linked to the policy aspects, then you can ask them later on. Thank you, Anita. Go ahead, Anita. Thank you.
Thank you, Laszlo. Good afternoon, everyone. So I will be presenting mostly the evaluation process. So the criteria that are used to evaluate your proposals, the proposal you submit under Life Nature. Next slide, please. So yes, what you already know, you already heard. So what is Life, Nature and Biodiversity? It is one of the main sources of EU funding for implementing the EU biodiversity strategy, including, of course, the habitats and birds directives and invasive alien species regulation. So in the last 3 years, 30 years to give you the full picture, around 3 billion euros of funding was spent on around 1,700 projects, saving endangered EU habitats and species, expanding the Natura 2000 network, removing invasive species, and boosting awareness on EU nature legislation and much more. Next slide, please. So as Frank already presented, we are talking about the standard action projects, the so-called SAPs. And under the Life 2023 SAP NAT call, there are 2 topics. The nature and biodiversity topic and the nature governance. So the nature biodiversity topic aims more or invites, let's say, projects that have concrete conservation activities aiming at implementing EU nature legislation and the EU biodiversity strategy. There is a total budget of 145 million euros and 3 possible funding rates can be requested, 60, 67, 75. I will go back to these funding rates, although Frank already anticipating how you can be eligible for a higher funding rate, like for 67% or 75%. Nature governance, well, proposals under this topic must support the implementation of the governance aspects of the EU biodiversity strategy for 2030, so compliance assurance, public participation, access to justice, and so on. The budget is rather limited, so competition is quite high. It's 3,400,000 euros, and the maximum funding rate is 60%. As you are probably already all aware, the deadline for the application submission is 6 September 2023. Next slide, please. So your project goes through different assessments. I will briefly explain the admissibility and eligibility criteria. Under admissibility, of course, what is assessed is that your project is actually submitted through the funding and tenders portal. That's the only possible way to submit an application. It must be readable, accessible, and printable. It must be complete, meaning that it must include all the documents and the mandatory annexes that are provided in the system. You need to use the forms provided in the submission system, but you must also, and this is very important, comply with the instructions therein, meaning when you open the application form, part B, you need to read the instructions. And this is a bit of a problem in the last 2 years, because, for example, there is a limit. Okay, there's a page, a maximum page number, which is 120, but the system cuts your proposal if you go beyond 120 pages. However, there's also a limit in font size, which is Arial 10, and you cannot use smaller font sizes, because if you do, and we had that in the past, you run the risk of, even if your project is fantastic, it can be assessed as inadmissible. So the font size, maximum font size is Arial 10, I repeat, and you should not delete the instructions. All of this is explained in the application form itself. So please take the time to read the instructions. Going to eligibility, of course, your project is eligible only when it is in scope, meaning that it relates to the subject matter, objectives, themes, priorities, eligible activities established in the call document. So please have a careful look at the call document before you apply. Of course, participants need to be eligible. They need to be legal entities. No natural persons can apply. They need to come from eligible countries, but there are some exceptions. Concerning the geographic coverage of your activities, well, proposals must relate to activities taking place in eligible countries. But activities outside eligible countries are possible as long as they are necessary to achieve EU environmental and climate objectives and to ensure the effectiveness of interventions carried within the eligible countries. For example, you can have activities in African countries aimed at the conservation of migratory birds in wintering areas, or actions implemented on a transboundary river can, of course, include activities in areas that are not covered by the eligible countries. Of course, this means that this is possible only when the environmental problem or the conservation problem you want to address cannot be solved successfully or efficiently unless actions are carried out in non-eligible countries. Next, please. So now we can move to the award criteria. Next again, please. Your project is assessed based on 4 award criteria, and I will go through each one of them. Relevance, quality, impact, and resources. The criteria are scored 0 to 20. And very important that you know is that the criterion on impact is weighted, is the only weighted criterion. It weighs 1.5, so it's one of the most important criterion. The minimum pass score is 55. You can also get some bonus points, which do not count in the minimum pass score. I will go through these 5 bonus points. You can get, they are based on a yes/no criterion. So either you get the bonus point or you do not get it. Either you get 0 points or you get the 2 points if you are eligible for those bonus points. And I will explain those bonus points a bit more in detail in a few minutes. Next slide, please. So concerning the first award criterion, relevance, every award criterion is subdivided into sub-criteria. So I will go into all the sub-criteria. I will not go into the details of every single sub-criteria, but I will try to focus on the most important ones, or the ones that need some clarification based on our experience of the last 2 evaluations. So the criterion 1 is relevance, and here what is assessed mainly is the compliance of your project with the objectives of life or of the sub-program nature and biodiversity, and this is what is covered under the first sub-criterion. The second one is very important, and it covers a bit what Frank already said. So under this sub-criterion, your project must be in line with the description included in the call document. So it needs to be fall into the category of the SAPs as described in the call document. But it also must be relevant based on the specific priorities that are in the call document. So what is assessed here is particularly important because it defines the urgency of the project based on the themes and the priorities described in the call document. Next slide, please. I will not go into the details because this is what Frank already said. But again, this is where the urgency of the project is assessed. So the project, just to wrap up what Frank already said, your project is considered, or let's say the projects that are considered more urgent are those that target habitat and species in the worst conservation status. So for instance, if they are unfavorable and declining, if they have an unfavorable and declining trend or conservation status, or even unfavorable bad and declining conservation status, if they are in U2 minus status, based on whether habitats and species are in the annexes of the Habitats Directive, or when they have the extinction risk is at the highest. And this is, of course, when the project targets species and habitats are not covered by EU nature legislation. Further prioritization of the proposals will be based on the compliance with and the contribution to the specific policy priorities defined again in section 2 of the call document, meaning the bird and the habitats directives, the IES regulation, and the biodiversity strategy. I added, if you go, sorry, to the previous slide, you see that in the info session on live for the 2021 call for proposals, I added a link in to a YouTube site, and that's where Frank actually went more into the details of each policy priority. So you might be, I would encourage you actually to have a look at that YouTube channel. Next, please. So moving on, what is also assessed under this first criterion is the soundness of the intervention logic. You will need to explain the methodology, meaning the tools, the techniques, the methods, the procedures that you will use to implement the technical part of your project. You need to justify why the proposed methodology is the most suitable for achieving the project objectives. Then another and the last aspect that is assessed under this criterion is the co-benefits, the spillover effect your project has on other policy areas beyond life, meaning, for example, agriculture, health, civil protection, jobs and growth, and so on. And it's very important that you describe in your proposal these synergies and this spillover effect, these co-benefits. Ideally, the project should concretely integrate project results into these other policy areas. So it is important that you identify also activities and tasks that address these other policy objectives, and even eventually even quantify this contribution. Next, please. So now we move to the second award criterion, impact. Again, I want to remind everyone that this is a very important award criterion. The score is multiplied by 1.5, and so therefore constitute an important part of the total final score of the project. So the assessment of this criterion will cover in particular the extent and quality of the expected impacts, the conservation benefits of the project at the end of the project itself. The impact, as Frank already said, must be concrete, realistic, quantified as far as possible. And please do not forget to fill in the KPIs in part C, consistently, of course, with what you explained in part A of the application form. Sorry, in part B of the application form. The criterion also assesses the extent to which there is a realistic strategy in place to ensure that the project results will be maintained or improved in the medium long term from the technical, administrative, and financial points of view. It also covers the assessment of the strategy to mobilize a wider uptake of the project solution beyond the project's direct beneficiaries and beyond the project duration. Therefore, this is about the potential of your project results to be replicated in the same in other sectors or places beyond the project. And finally, this criterion also assesses the exploitation strategy that you put in place. Exploitation focuses more on the actual use of the outputs generated by the project during its implementation. Outputs that can be used in other contexts, in other sectors, or for other purposes. And this may include know-how, guidelines, protocols, databases, datasets, and so on. So the scoring under this award criterion will take into account the clarity, the ambition, and the feasibility of all these proposed approaches. Next, please. The third award criterion refers to the quality of the proposal. Therefore, it is important that your project is clear, is feasible, and that your how, when, where, and by whom the activities will be implemented. This must be very clear in your work plan. Your work plan must be achievable and properly planned. The deliverables and milestones must be defined. The risk assessment must be thorough. The permits, necessary permits that you might need must be taken into account and explained in your proposal. Also, and very important for nature and biodiversity projects, the involvement of key actors that are not part of the consortium is very important and must be addressed. Letters of support or of commitment are very welcome to guarantee this support from other stakeholders. So this is quite important. Also, what is assessed is whether the implementation sites chosen are relevant, are adequate, and justified. The plan to monitor and report on impacts is also assessed, and there is a specific section in the application form, as well as the appropriateness and the quality of the proposed measures to communicate and disseminate the project and its results to different target groups. Next, please. So very important is that under this award criterion, you might have some project might foresee activities that are eligible only if sites are designated before the end of the project, or standard data forms updated before the end of the project, or management plans approved by the competent authority before the end of the project. When these conditions are there, the project can be considered eligible, at least the activities can be considered eligible at the first stage, but the issue is when you arrive at the end of the project and the designation has not happened, or the data forms have not been updated before its end, then you run the risk to have your activities considered ineligible at the end of the project. So this is quite risky. So this is why now we explicitly included in the call document that it is important that you submit, if you fall under these cases, that you submit a formal letter of support or commitment from the member state competent authority, in case of, for example, Natura 2000 designation, or when the standard data forms have to be updated, that you include also a milestone in the work plan and a proper follow-up is considered in the work plan, and that you ensure that sufficient time is built in the project planning so that the designation or approval is realistically achievable before the end of the project. Again, this is very important because we see that sometimes projects end and these conditions are not met. And so we have a problem then to consider other costs as eligible. Next, please. Award criterion 4, so this is the last award criterion on the resources. This is where the adequacy of the consortium and of the project management is assessed, considering specifically the budget. Of course, the rules, the life rules need to be complied with. The budget needs to be reasonable and justified. The correct co-financing rate needs to be requested. You have, for those that are in experience, you have two budget tables. One very general total budget table is provided in part A, and then you have to annex a detailed budget table. Of course, both tables must be consistent. And for major cost items in the detailed budget table that you annex, you can add lines so that you detail or provide a detailed breakdown of the major or bigger cost items under one cost categories. Please also don't forget to indicate the work package to which these cost items belong to. Another sub-criterion under resources is the project green management. So this will be assessed again by the experts. And finally, the value for money. So actually, this considers the conservation benefit versus the resources budgeted. So what the experts ask themselves when they have to assess the value for money is whether the overall indicative investment is reasonable in view of the expected impacts and results of your project. Next, please. So I was mentioning in the previous slide that we also assess if the correct funding rate is requested. Again, Frank already went through this quickly, but I will summarize. The default funding rate is 60%. You are entitled to 75% co-funding rate if your project exclusively targets priority species and habitats. You're entitled to 67% if your project targets both priority and non-priority habitats and species, but there needs to be a clear focus on priority habitat and species. This means that most activities must be designed to explicitly and directly target priority habitats and species. Next, please. Another important aspect is in case you need external co-financing, because you cannot co-finance the rest of the project with your own funds. It is important that you provide a co-financing declaration, and there is a specific template for that you annex to your proposal. At proposal stage, the co-financing declaration can also be not confirmed. However, if your project goes through and then the project enters the revision process, because it is shortlisted, it is crucial that you provide a co-financing declaration that is confirmed at the latest 2.5 months after the notification. It's very important because otherwise we will not, most probably not sign the grant agreement. So without a confirmed co-financing declaration, grant agreements cannot be signed. Next, please. So now we can move on to the bonus points. As I said, there are 5 of them. The first one, you can get 2 points if your project offers exceptional synergies and promotes significant co-benefits between the live sub-programs. One thing I did not say, the bonus points are given only exceptionally. This is why I insist on the word exceptional. So to get the 2 bonus points, the synergies need to be clearly described, well developed, and justified in your proposal. the project needs to bring substantial concrete benefits to these other policy areas. And again, here we're talking about policy areas, the policies and priorities and objectives of the other life sub-programs, nature and circular economy and quality of life. These benefits must be quantified, for example, through the KPIs or the indicators, and monitoring must be foreseen also during the project implementation. So this is how you get 2 points under synergies. Next, please. You can get 2 additional points if your proposal is primarily implemented in the outermost regions. I will not go through what are the outermost regions, but what is important here is that most of the activities must be implemented in the outermost regions to get the 2 bonus points. Next, please. Considering uptake, you can get 2 points if the use of concrete results of other projects are foreseen in your project, and this needs to be very clearly demonstrated in the intervention logic, and it needs to be absolutely necessary to achieve project objectives. So the proposal must be very clear about how the results of other EU projects will be used. And it's not just only a question of transfer of best practices and experiences. That would really not be enough to get the 2 bonus points. It is encouraged by under life, but this is not sufficient. Next, please. Exceptional catalytic potential. It is exceptional, again, the word exceptional, you see, when the strategy in place leads to a significant multiplication of the impact of the project itself. The extent of the replication needs to be such that it triggers an effect that amplifies the project outcome on a much, much wider scale. For example, in other sectors, cities, at regional or country level, or in other countries. Next, please. And finally, the last bonus points. If your project is transnational, you can have 2 extra points. However, implementation of the activities in 2 or more countries is a precondition to receive these bonus points. In addition, the cooperation must be between 2 different countries, must be essential to reach the objectives of the project. And the proposal must convincingly describe the environmental and climate benefit of the activities implemented in each of the countries involved. Next, please. So this is my last slide. For under nature and biodiversity, what we have experienced is, or what we consider very important, is that a project should really have a solid analysis of the problems and baseline, that the key stakeholders are involved, that there is a robust assessment of the impacts of the project with the KPIs. In the part B, this needs to be very well explained. And of course, value for money. As Frank was saying, the budget for this sub-program is very limited and competition is very high. So the projects that are more urgent, that have higher or highest value for money are finally shortlisted. And it's very important that there is a clear strategy on how to maintain and multiply the impacts of the project. So again, impact. So what we see as common problems in projects that we receive, in proposals, that we assess, is that there is, for example, insufficient background information and baseline, or the objectives are too broad or too many, or even that research activities take the lead rather than concrete conservation activities. There is insufficient support or commitment from stakeholders and competent authorities. In nature, sometimes this is so crucial that the project can even fail if there's no support from stakeholders or competent authorities. The partnership does not have the sufficient, let's say, technical expertise, or there is an over-optimistic and unrealistic quantification of impacts, or there's just a lack of quantification of impacts. Sometimes replication, very often actually, replication is confused with networking and dissemination. Replication, as I explained earlier, is different than dissemination. And there are just very vague plans to sustain the project and the results after the project ends. Next, please. And I think, yes, that's all from my side, Laszlo.
Thanks a lot, Anita. It was a very clear and comprehensive presentation. Let's see the questions. We have received quite a bunch of questions, so
Yeah.
I will call, of course, the other speakers to contribute.
Maybe Laszlo, if I can, I remember
Yes.
the first question that in the previous session, it was about whether live SAP projects can be implemented outside Natura 2000.
Yes, there was a question indeed that you could take.
Frank answered, but maybe I would like to complement a little bit based on the life rules, if I may, because I think it's quite important.
Yes, it's quite fundamental. So go ahead.
Yes, well, normally annex species or habitats, for example, the Annex 1 or 2 of the Habitats Directive or birds, Annex 1 bird species of the Birds Directive must be implemented in SCIs or SACs or SPAs, respectively, if we're talking about birds. They should be implemented in Natura 2000. However, activities outside Natura 2000 is possible for the improvement of the ecological coherence and connectivity of the Natura 2000 network. For example, when we want to prevent genetic isolation or when we want to allow species to migrate. So this needs to be, of course, demonstrated, and guarantees must be provided for the long-term continuation of these investments when you work outside Natura 2000. So it is possible, but it is very important that a commitment for giving these sites the most appropriate legal and contractual protection is guaranteed before the project ends. So yeah, I wanted to comment on this.
Thank you. The next question I will take myself. It's because it's quite simple. Can an NGO be a coordinating beneficiary on a biodiversity project? Yes, of course, we have a lot of projects led by NGOs. It's only the natural persons that cannot be beneficiaries, but all other kinds of entities in principle can benefit from life co-financing. Am I correct, Anita?
Yeah.
Good. Then the next one, it would be for Anita. Is there a minimum of partner countries to do the application with, or is it possible to do the application with partners from the same country?
Yes, absolutely. It's perfectly possible to not have a transnational project. So to implement your project within the same country with partners from the same country, absolutely. This is perfectly, I think, yeah, most of our projects are from one country, so you will not get the 2 bonus points. But again, do not force. We see that projects sometimes maybe are more, make more sense to be implemented in one single country, but they somehow, to get those 2 additional points, try to include partners from other countries. But you see, when this is very artificial, you won't get the 2 points. So we prefer that you have and this also affects the quality of your project. So do not force a second country in the partnership. What is important is that your project is consistent, is reasonable, is well constructed, even if it's just implemented in one country.
Thank you, Anita. And it would be Frank for the next one, because you already talked about it a little bit during your presentation, that compared to other topics, there seems to be no need to be innovative for a project within the nature subprogram. Is that correct? I believe the answer is yes, but please elaborate if you want.
Well, it's difficult to elaborate if the answer is yes, and it is yes, because there's many situations where there is no need for innovation, but the need for action. And LIFE is, since the beginning, as regards nature and biodiversity, an instrument that is also an implementation. It's just about not just about testing new approaches, which is of course very relevant when it comes to environmental technologies, something that could go on the market or so. But when it comes to conservation, what is important is that you have results, not whether your project is innovative or has a demonstration character. Of course, it can have an added value to have a demonstration character, but even that is not so important as compared to the other domains, because maybe there is another element I'd like to highlight. It's the capacity that a project creates, and LIFE is not the only fund. It's a relatively small fund in the European Union. There is other funds that are also available for conservation work. But LIFE is very often a test bed. It's a school for people to learn how to run big projects. And so the building of that capacity is extremely important for LIFE. And so that's perhaps a hidden added value, which is not sufficiently highlighted.
Thank you, Frank. And I believe the next one will be also for you. It's good to clarify actually this issue that is asked here. That does it mean that a species that is in big danger but not in worse state yet is not to be protected in the LIFE program?
Well, we would of course assume that a species that is in big danger is either recognized as such in the conservation status report of a member state, or at the European level in the IUCN Red List. And maybe I would like to mention here also that if a species is, let's say, not listed as in a worst conservation status, but still listed as endangered in an IUCN Red List, even it's a species of community importance, it is eligible for 75%. So we always take the assessment that is the most friendly towards the higher co-funding rate. So I would assume that there would be no such situation where a species is in big danger, but that is not recognized by anybody. We often see that people locally have the feeling that it is in big danger, and it might be locally in big danger, but unfortunately we have to prioritize, and the prioritization is when the species is in big danger at the EU, or at least at the national level. In practice, at the national biogeographical level, that's the level where the member states report the conservation status.
So thank you, Frank. You basically almost answered the next question, which is about this issue for co-financing of 75%, the status of the target species at which level can be evaluated by geographical region, national or regional or local.
Yeah, actually, if you look at the documents, the call document, I think it clearly says it needs to be in the worst conservation status, so U2 minus, both in the national report and in the European level assessment. But let me clarify that the European level assessment is not for the entire EU in Article 17, it's for the biogeographical region. So let's take an example. Germany has a continental biogeographical region. So you have a species that is in U2 minus in the report for Germany for the continental region, and in the European level report for the continental region, then it falls under the 75%. If it's not the case for both, it wouldn't fall under the 75%. This sounds a bit strange, perhaps, and exaggerated. The reason why we did this is that we have so many species in that situation. Otherwise, everything would be 75%. And the higher we get with the co-funding rates, and the more projects we have with 75% co-funding, the less projects we are able to finance. And this is one of our big concerns that we have for the moment.
Indeed, and we have to focus our funding to the most endangered species. So let's see the next set. Thank you for the explanations. Yeah, so this I guess it's for Anita. So the co-financing should be only from public state funds, programs, etc., or could it be from own sources of the applicants or its partners?
Yeah, indeed, it can be from own resources, absolutely. it's only when it's not from your own resources and you need external co-financing that we request the co-financing declarations, in which this other authority declares that co-finances for a certain amount. It does not have to be all the co-financing, but even just, I don't know, 10,000 euros to help co-finance your part of the project. But yes, you can also co-finance from your own resources completely, absolutely.
Thank you. And the next one would be for either for Frank or Danielle. I'm not sure which one of you will be happier to answer. Is it eligible to submit a proposal for river restoration actions if the upper and lower sections are within Natura 2000, but the middle one is outside? Maybe Frank. Or
I can also answer in case.
Frank, we don't hear you. You're muted. Yeah, muted.
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
So I think Anita already partially answered that actions outside Natura 2000 are of course eligible under certain circumstances. And one is of course that the investment is sustainable. I think in a case like the river case, there is an additional argument, which is actually the connectivity. I mean, typically it's when it's about an obstacle, that's clear. I mean, an obstacle will always have a positive impact also about the site that is elsewhere. But even when it comes to restoring the structure of a river outside the Natura 2000 site, that might be perfectly eligible, provided that you can show that it's part of a wider coherence issue with a network and the investment is long-term.
Yeah, and in the core document, if I may complement, you also need to submit a commitment, a signed commitment from the competent authority for giving that site the most appropriate legal protection status.
Oh, that's the long-term commit. That's the long-term sustainability, because of course, given the limited resources, we cannot really spend a lot of funding on things that are perhaps, you know, modified again in a few years and destroyed. So we need to focus on what is really long-term sustainable.
Thank you, Frank and Anita. And Anita, I think it would be best for you to answer the next one. It's a bit peculiar question. That is this application procedure taking a full-time job?
I don't know. And this is not something that we know, or I don't know. It depends, of course. If you do that at the very end, close to the deadline, probably you need to dedicate full time on that. If you start now, probably not. It depends on how complex your project, your proposal setup is, and how much time you have.
It's more to implement the project that we are most likely requiring.
To implement. I thought
no, the question was about writing it, but I think later on it's really a full-time job.
Well, if it's implementing, normally it is best, I think, to have a full-time coordinator in the project.
Thank you. So yeah, let's take the still around this second question on the list. Still around the 67% issue. So for the 67% co-financing, do we have to follow any specific proportion criteria across the project area between priority and non-priority species, or how is it defined? Maybe Anita, for you.
Yeah, well, there's not a specific proportion, but what we say is that there needs to be a clear focus on the priority ones, and that most activities are designed for the priority habitats or species. But there's no proportion, let's say.
And then the next one is which project type is more appropriate for policy and capacity building related to biodiversity protection? Anita or
I think Gustavo.
Yeah, Gustavo.
Sure. Okay, so well, all sub-projects have some component of policy and capacity building, but I would say that for the types of projects, it could be either the SNAPs, So which are the strategic nature projects that focus on the catalyzing of the implementation of the PAF, the prioritized action frameworks. Because here one of the actions is provided the means to implement the policy through strategic documents and other actions, but also to include the institutional support and capacity building actions. Here, be aware that there is no snap call this year, so that will be for next year. And the other option could be the nature governance topic, which addresses the compliance assurance, public participation, and access to justice. If this is the focus, of course, then there is scope for capacity building activities by, for example, improving professional qualifications and training.
Thanks a lot, Gustavo. Maybe we take one more question and then we would switch to our third presentation from the project that we have invited. I'm not sure if Daniel, can you answer this question on the opportunities to fund development of innovative financing mechanism for nature restoration and biodiversity via, for example, carbon market or biodiversity banking?
It needs to be clearly linked with the priorities.
We can't really hear you. Your mic is muted, Daniel. Nope, we don't hear you.
Thank you, Frank. It needs to be clearly linked with the policy priorities as highlighted in Frank's presentation. But of course, if you want to include or raise through financial schemes additional funds for your project, that is possible. But please, Anita, Laszlo, correct me if I'm wrong. But I think it might be very challenging under the traditional projects to involve this. And I'm not sure LIFE would be the right tool for this, even though it could be very interesting. It would be challenging.
Yeah, most likely it will be very complex. But thank you for all of you that have spoken so far, and we would now switch to the third session in our slot. So I call Gustavo and then Lisbeth to present the project on grasshoppers. Thank you.
Thank you, Laszlo.
Thank you.
I'm not too sure the presentation is okay now. So now my colleagues Frank and Daniel have already presented the priorities, and Anita dealt with the award criteria details for nature and biodiversity call for standard action projects. However, in the case of invertebrates, particularly insects, there are some specificities that are worth taking into account when putting together a proposal. Dr. Lisbeth Teichner is here with us today as well to share her experience in drafting a successful proposal that focuses on insects. But before we welcome Dr. Teichner, next slide, please. I would like to share the options that as a potential applicant you have available, which is the first point of this presentation, proposal approaches. Next slide, please. So there are essentially two main approaches or a combination of them that can lead to a strong insect proposal. We have the species approach that has as a primary target one or more species of insects. And then the habitat approach that focuses on the restoration or conservation of the habitat for the species. Now, if you decide to take the species approach, you have the following list that you may want to check. On one hand, there is the Habitats Directive, which contains more than 100 species of arthropods that can be targeted if they are in unfavorable and declining conservation status. As we've seen before, this is at EU and national biogeographical region level where the project is taking place. And on the other hand, and this is something important to highlight. Next slide, please. There is a high number of insect species, more than 500, from 6 different groups, including the main pollinator groups, which are not covered, mostly not covered by the Habitats Directive, and that can be targeted since they have been assessed as endangered or critically endangered in the relevant red list. Now, if you decide to target the habitats of the species instead, this is also valid. Next slide, please. This is an approach that can work well when the main threat for the species in the target areas is, for example, habitat deterioration or habitat loss, in which case the main objective will be the conservation or creation of the habitat. But monitoring actions of insect populations will be included to capture the positive impact the project has on the species. Here again, there are 2 listings that are to be checked: the EU Habitats Directive and the European Red List of Habitats. So now that we have gone through the options that you have as a potential applicant, we are going to see an example of a successful insect proposal that is currently being funded. So the floor is yours, Lisbeth. Next slide, please. Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to present our LIFE project. I would like to start with some information on the approach we have chosen. The grasshopper is present in southern France in a small region with a unique dry grassland ecosystem. And this grassland is also a priority habitat, Natura 2000 habitat. And it is also with a negative trend, so we could have worked on this habitat, even if it's partly protected by a nature reserve, and it's also Natura 2000 site. We still have quite many threats on this habitat, and habitat loss is going on. But as we, next slide, please. As we had already designed several actions on the grasshopper, we decided to take the species approach in 2020. And this grasshopper is an endemic species in the plain crow, Prionotropis rhodanica. A strong decline was observed for the last 20 and 30 years. And currently we only know 3 subpopulations which are isolated. And as you can see on the picture, it's a species with short wings, not able to fly, and so it's not really mobile. And it is listed in the European and global red list as critically endangered, and not in the annex of the directives, as Frank already told you. So even in 2020, we had the possibility to ask for life funds. It was a project topic, the threatened species of the red list. Next slide, please. You heard already that the baseline is very important to know what you want to do. And we had the possibility for this grasshopper. We had already a good knowledge on the species. The decline of the species was observed since the 1990s, and research and observation started in this period. And one really important milestone was in 2014 with a workshop and with the elaboration of a conservation strategy, where we worked together with the IUCN. And from this time on, we really worked a lot on the species with research programs, on the habitat requirements, on the monitoring of the populations, on the breeding of the grasshopper. We started the breeding program, and also there were a study on the potential protection by bird species. Next slide, please. So our project has 4 objectives, and as you heard several times, it's really important to link objectives with actions and also with the expected results. It should be really clear and logical. And our 4 objectives are first to increase the area of favorable habitat, so all the work about habitat restoration and adaptation of grazing management. The area is grazed by sheep, and it's really this grazing has an important impact on the habitat quality. The second objective is to reduce threats such as the predation by bird species. There are mainly 2 species which seems to be important: the cattle egret and also the lesser kestrel, which is a protected species. So it's a little bit difficult because we work on 2 protected species. The third objective is to improve the breeding of the grasshopper, because we still have problems in this breeding program. And to start, if everything goes well, with the reintroduction. And we have also several actions on the communication to educate, to raise awareness of local stakeholders, and also several actions to exchange experience and knowledge with experts. For this to improve the conservation status of the species. Next slide, please. So our project is a quite small project compared to other LIFE projects. We are 4 beneficiaries. The Conservatoire d'Espaces Naturels is the coordinator. The Chamber of Agriculture worked with us on grazing management actions, and 2 zoos work on the grasshopper breeding. They have different competences and they complete each other. 4 years of duration, and this is all mainly linked to the financing. We have a budget of 1.9 million euros. And 2020, for the species approach for red list species, we got only 60% of co-financing, of European co-financing. Now it's up to 75%, as you heard just before. And it was necessary to find this 40%. And it seems that 4 years are quite short, even we had a good knowledge on the species. Next slide. Stakeholders and partners. We really try to involve all the stakeholders who are really important for the project, national authorities. You heard already from the National Contact Point, which is a really important institution if you start to work on a LIFE project. Authorities are also important for us for all the permits, because this grasshopper is strictly protected in France. And so we need quite a lot of permits. Local stakeholders are, for example, landowners. One important private landowner for us is BMW, because on the testing site of BMW, we found one of the 3 last subpopulations. We work with the sheep breeders, with NGOs, and a very important point is the cooperation with national and international experts, with universities, with the IUCN Grasshopper Specialist Group, and we are also in contact with the European Association for Zoos. Next slide, please. This international cooperation, and mainly the cooperation with the IUCN Grasshopper Group, allowed us to create a network of Prionotropis specialists. You find several species of the same genus in Southern Europe, with similar habitat requirements and similar problems. Most of them are endangered. So with the colleagues, with the experts, we meet, we have regular meetings online, but we also try to some visit, and it's really in the with the idea to work out a larger project on the protection of dry grassland in Southern Europe with the insect species on these habitats. Next slide, please, and I give the floor back to Gustavo.
Thank you, Lisbeth, for sharing your experience when applying for life funding. That's very useful. I suppose to close this presentation, in addition to the general advice concerning the design, the good design of any proposal given earlier, I would like to provide some tips that can also be useful for a good quality application geared specifically towards insects. So first of all, I could not stress enough the needs to provide a clear and quantified baseline at the local level. Sometimes there's like a project provided at the baseline, but it's not at the local level. So that that could be improved because this is a crucial step. And this lays the, if you will, the foundations for a strong application. Particularly because the award criterion that is worth the most impact depends on this information. So if the baseline is vague or the impact cannot be measured, and this will typically lead to receiving a lower score. So we have seen from Lisbeth that in their application, they had like good knowledge on the target species and the habitat. This had been obviously done beforehand. Also, I would advise you to reflect on the options that are available to you as an applicant and adopt the approach that would, if you will, increase the chances to obtain the funding. As well as to think about the requirements for the different bonus points. For example, you have bonus point 2, which is the project on outmost regions. There are a few endemic insect species that are threatened that typically live there. Also very important to get all the relevant stakeholders involved, including the authorities and the experts from the scientific community, but also NGOs and local stakeholders such as farmers, of course, as appropriate. Please keep in mind that research activities that can be funded in the LIFE program are limited. Okay, there are always some essential aspects that are necessary for the implementation of the project. This does not mean that research activities are not possible at all, but these are limited. And in addition, I would invite you to consider adopting an international approach, for example, by liaising with IUCN, SSC, especially groups for invertebrates, because this has proved to be very useful in the past. And perhaps also not to underestimate the time that it takes to put together the proposal. Now, having said that, I will encourage you to submit your insect proposal, even if it's not perfect, because you'll receive some useful feedback that can help you build a stronger proposal in the future. So I think that's all for now. I hope we have time for questions. In the next slide, yes, you can see some contact details in case you would like to get in touch to discuss some practical aspects. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Gustavo and Lisbeth. That was very interesting, actually. On the other hand, I'm afraid that our time has run out for questions, then maybe we can take one on the top of the list. So, Julia, if you can show us. But something maybe linked to this project.
There are none, but I think Gustavo had one question that he wanted to ask.
I have a question because this is something that it will be very good to share, and it's like how the support that you obtained, Lisbeth, from IUCN. So how was your experience with them? How was it easy to collaborate, and how did it go?
As I told you, we work with IUCN, with the Grasshopper Specialist Group, or even with other specialist groups for many years. It started in 2014, and it's mainly with the president, Axel Hochkirch, who worked a lot in the on the grasshopper with students and also with a PhD. And this cooperation is going on, and even now we work on the reintroduction strategy together with the IUCN and our network of experts. I contacted European experts, but the global network, it's really the Grasshopper Specialist Group. And this gives us the opportunity also to exchange experience. For example, we are in contact with a specialist in New Zealand who works on a similar species with similar problems. And this is always a very good possibility to improve the proper actions.
Thanks a lot, Lisbeth. And also Gustavo. So I think we can hand over to Julia, but before that, I wish you good luck with your project, and I hope you will be successful.
Thank you. We need it because we still have difficulties.
Yes.
It's not so easy, even with a grasshopper.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you also.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And Julia, the floor is yours.
Yes. So thank you very much, Laszlo, for bringing your colleagues, and even a project example like the one of Lisbeth is always good to see the practical side of things, and project beneficiaries definitely know it even better than us. So as the participants might have already noticed, on one of my sites, I never know which one, there is actually a poll that they can participate to. Just 2 seconds to tell us there in slide how useful this session was for you. That's crucial feedback for us. So please let us know. And if you're still with us, you actually know why.